Good morning. It's great to be here. When I was asked if I would attend a conference at the Chamber of Commerce focused on entrepreneurship and particularly focused on the building up of regional ecosystems, I obviously said yes. The Chamber has for more than a century really been celebrating the work of entrepreneurs starting companies and scaling companies, whether it be on Main Street or sort of small businesses or faster growing kind of younger entrepreneurial companies. It played a really important role for more than a century. And a conference like this that tries to build an umbrella and bring together a lot of different organizations focused on entrepreneurship and make sure that we're all doing what we can as a nation to focus on entrepreneurship, and particularly to double down on the regional efforts is really very important. And that's really what I want to talk about, the idea of the rise of the rest. Some of these other regions, and many of you are very actively involved in them, that are rising up to be strong entrepreneurial ecosystems and really can power our nation, power our economy, drive innovation, drive economic growth, ensure our global competitiveness. A lot of the activity is in Silicon Valley, particularly in the technology world. A lot of the focus is in Silicon Valley. A lot of capital is focused in Silicon Valley, but the story of American entrepreneurship, as all of you know, is much broader, and this rise of the rest is very important. So that's what I want to focus on. But first, maybe take a step back and provide a little context. I think if you think about the story of America, and sitting here in Washington, D.C., really just steps away from the White House and the Washington Monument and so forth, it's hard not to recognize that we didn't become the leading economy in the world by accident. The United States was a startup just over 200 years ago. It started with an idea of democracy from pioneers who were willing to come over on boats because they thought this would be a place to take a stand and have a better life. But then what happened was the growth of America was powered by entrepreneurs who created companies and entire industries in this country, led us to become the leading entrepreneurial economy, and through that led us to become the leading economy in the world, which led us to become what some would call the leader of the free world. This didn't happen by accident. We didn't just wake up and suddenly we were the leading economy in the world. It was entrepreneurs who took a stand, took the risk, who had an idea, and as I said, it wasn't just about their company, it was about entire industries that ended up being centered here, and as a result drove enormous economic growth. I saw that firsthand 30 years ago with the growth of the internet, basically birthed by research that was done by the government, particularly the defense agencies, that created the basic tenets of the internet. And then a bunch of companies, including AOL, starting in Tysons Corner, Virginia, not just about 15, 20 minutes from here, really had the idea of taking this to the masses. When we got started, only 3% of people were online. 97% weren't. Those 3% on average were online 1 hour a week. And most people thought this was a crazy idea. Because most people thought back then in 1985 that this was just something that like weird hobbyist hackers would be interested in. It never would really be a broad mainstream market. But we believed in that idea. And other companies believed in that idea. And now, almost 30 years later, the internet is part of everyday life. I'm sure you all have a device you're carrying with you that is connected to the internet, and you're connected really all the time through multiple devices and multiple networks. That led to the growth of the internet because it was started largely in the United States. The initial wave of innovation happened in the United States, and a lot of great companies were formed and grew, which have created enormous economic growth, ensured that we can be competitive in what is now a more intense global world, as well as creating an enormous number of jobs. This is the story of America. This is the story of entrepreneurship. So why is it important to take a step back and focus on that? The reason is because other countries are figuring this out. They've figured out that the secret sauce that's driven the American economy, the American story, is entrepreneurship. And they're moving very aggressively on a variety of fronts in terms of trying to be attractive to talent, around having different policies around immigration, creating incentives around capital, more investment in research, a whole slew of things by a wide variety of countries all around the world that are stepping up their activity, and they want to be the world's most entrepreneurial nation. America right now is the world's most entrepreneurial nation and can and should continue to be the world's most entrepreneurial nation, but it's not going to happen if we get cocky or complacent. Other people are stepping up their efforts. And so I think there's three ways to try to make a contribution, at least the way I've approached it. The first is kind of get in those garages with entrepreneurs and provide some of the capital and provide hopefully some expertise to help them create great companies that can also power great industries. That's my firm Revolution. Some of the companies that were mentioned, like Zipcar and Living Social, are examples of that. That's sort of my day job, if you will. The second is chairing an initiative that was launched at the White House about 1.5 years ago called the Startup America Partnership. With partnerships of the Case Foundation, the Kauffman Foundation, and a variety of great corporate partners, we've now expanded to 28 regions around the country, with entrepreneurs leading the way in each of the regions, but knitting together the disparate, sometimes disconnected activities in each of these regions to create more of a networked effect, more network density, if you will, which is really where the action is on these different ecosystems, as I'm sure many of you will talk about today. How do you build up these different regions? And the third area is on the policy front. As I have now lived in Washington for the last 3 decades, gotten to know some folks on both Republicans and Democrats, and trying to play a role in building some bridges and getting people to focus on entrepreneurship. And I was delighted 5 or 6 months ago to be in the Rose Garden across the way as President Obama signed the Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act. And I was particularly delighted to be standing next to Eric Cantor, who was also instrumental, along with the president, in getting that passed. It was Republicans and Democrats coming together in a bipartisan way to focus on entrepreneurship, put policies in place that improved entrepreneurs' access to capital, whether it be crowdfunding, which I know we'll have a panel to talk about shortly, which is critically important for the entrepreneurs in regions and sectors that are not well served by venture capital, which is most of the country. That's where crowdfunding can be really helpful to give those entrepreneurs their first shot, as well as things like the on-ramp for IPOs. So the Jobs Act, Jumpstarting Our Business Startups, was the first step to make sure we redouble our commitment to entrepreneurship. The next step, which also has been introduced in the Senate with broad bipartisan support, is the Startup Act 2.0, which deals with a number of things, but the particular, most important one is high-skilled immigration. As I said, other countries are changing their policies to become more immigration-friendly, to try to attract the entrepreneurs and the engineers that could create the next generation of great companies. And we need to do a better job of attracting and keeping the best and brightest here and getting them to come, start companies here. And we kind of do this pretty well up to a certain point. Right now, if you go to these great research universities, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, et cetera, over half of the graduates getting PhDs and masters are from other countries. That's the good news. The bad news is we give them this great education, and then most of the time we kick them out of the country. So you can't stay here. You have to go back to your country. And guess what they do? They go back, kind of disappointed, kind of frustrated. They're kind of starting to like the idea of America. And they start companies there that compete with companies here, which is insane. So changing our immigration policies, particularly around high-skilled immigration, so the idea of stapling a green card to these diplomas, for example, not just making it easy for them to stay here, but asking them to stay here and be part of the American entrepreneurial engine is critically important. So that is an area that needs focus right now because we're kind of knocking on the door of an election, as you well know. It's not going to get a lot of attention in the next 6 or 7 weeks in all likelihood, but once the election happens, it is one of the central issues that we need to focus on as a nation. Final point on the rise of the rest, and I want to open up for some questions, because I think what you have on your minds might be more interesting than what I have on my mind. The notion of the rise of the rest is not new in terms of thinking about America or thinking about American entrepreneurship. There have been many people who have talked about the rise of the rest globally as nations rise up, China, Brazil, India, other nations, and even if the United States' economy continues to be reasonably strong, the growth of these emerging nations, the rise of the rest, if you will, changes the relative balance, changes the competitive balance. And a lot of people are focusing on what are those rising regions, and frankly, a lot of capital globally is now focused on trying to fuel these rising regions where they believe there are disproportionate growth opportunities. The same phenomenon, I believe, we're beginning to see the glimmers of within the United States. That the entrepreneurial sectors, particularly on the tech side, where I'm most familiar, but also in other sectors as well, is right now too focused, capital is too focused on a few places, and Silicon Valley in particular. And I want to be clear here, Silicon Valley is awesome. It's wonderful. It's the pride of America. It's the envy of the world in terms of its ability to create interesting, innovative, technology-driven companies. Awesome. But there are also a lot of awesome entrepreneurs all across the country that are in Silicon Valley, don't want to be in Silicon Valley. They're in upstate New York like Chobani, or Denver, Colorado like Chipotle, or Baltimore, Maryland like Under Armour, or Atlanta, Georgia like Spanx. Many other companies that want to build companies there and want to have the entrepreneurial ecosystem supporting their efforts there, whether it be on the capital front or on the talent front or on just building a sort of the mentorship community front. This is an enormous opportunity as a nation, because if we can even out entrepreneurship across the country, we will have a much more robust entrepreneurial engine to power us for this next century. And that's why what you're doing here and gathered here, today, really this whole week, is why it's so important. It's not just a focus on entrepreneurship, which clearly is important for the reasons I mentioned. It's a focus on building up these ecosystems at a regional level, so each of the regions around the country has an opportunity to build on its unique strengths and build the kind of ecosystem that can really power the next generation of companies. That will result, in my opinion, with a flow of capital that accelerates over the next decade, in part driven by crowdfunding that makes it easier for investors to find companies in these regions that are sort of hard to find right now. But that will then lead to follow-on investments from venture capital firms that will start focusing on some of these second or third tier regions which right now don't get much attention. And it's not just about capital, it's also about talent. And as we educate people about what's happening in these other regions, we also will see a broader flow of talent. So it's a great moment that as we stand here, we're still the world's most entrepreneurial nation. If we continue to get people to work together in a bipartisan way around pro-entrepreneurship policies, particularly the Startup Act 2.0, we'll have the right policy framework to enable that to continue. But it really requires the efforts of the entrepreneurs starting the companies and all of you who are building the regional ecosystems that fuel the growth and support the growth of those companies. If we do that, if we all do our part, I'm confident we will remain the world's most entrepreneurial nation and therefore have a robust economy and therefore be able to create more jobs and therefore be able to compete globally in a world which is getting more entrepreneurial and getting more competitive.